Hi, everyone. I am Dr. Laura Wilson, and I am the Curator of Paleontology here at the Sternberg Museum of Paleontology in Hays, Kansas. As part of our National Fossil Day 2020 celebrations, we have done a social media takeover on all of our social media platforms. So make sure you check us out on Facebook, on Instagram, and on Twitter. As part of this, we also wanted to do a Facebook Live event where people who followed us on the different social media platforms had a chance to ask questions that could be answered by a paleontologist, in this case being myself. And so we had several of y'all reach out on a couple of different on our platforms with some great questions, and I am very excited to get to answer them. If you have any that come up, feel free to post them in the comments and I'll come back through, and you might not get a live video answer, but I will be happy to answer them as replies to any comments. Okay, so let's get into it. One of the first questions we had was from Isaac, age 6. I think this was posted by proxy on Facebook, and I wanted to cover this one much first because there's so much to get into it. Because we're doing, in the age of COVID, and trying to minimize the amount of time we spend around other people, I put together a PowerPoint some slides so that I could show some images so people could understand the questions and the answers a little bit better. Okay, so Isaac says that he goes fossil hunting in Lyme Regis in England, where Mary Anning first discovered plesiosaurs. He's found a lot of ichthyosaur vertebrae and ammonites, but wants to find a Basilosaurus bone. And so his questions are, where was the first Basilosaurus fossil found, and what do you think it ate? So I got really excited about this because there's kind of so much to unpack and to get to talk about in this question. So I wanted to start, I kind of went in order of different things that Isaac brought up. And I wanted to start with Mary Anning. Mary Anning is like the mother of paleontology to a lot of us. So she was a fossil hunter in Lyme Regis, which is in England, in the early to mid 1800s. So this is just when paleontology was picking up as a science, and she is definitely kind of the first female on record fossil hunter. And so she's a huge poster child for women in paleontology as well. If you are not familiar with your England geography and geology, Lyme Regis is actually down here on the southern part of England. And the types of rocks that are in this area, they're both Cretaceous, which is kind of the end of the Mesozoic age of the dinosaurs, and the Jurassic. And so Mary, what she would find, she found the first plesiosaurs, the most complete ichthyosaurs. She found the first pterosaurs outside of Germany, and she found lots of fossil fish. So a lot of marine ecosystems going on where she was fossil hunting. And so to go back to Isaac's question, he brings up Basilosaurus. So Basilosaurus here in Kansas, we talk a lot about marine reptiles since we talk about kind of late Cretaceous, late Mesozoic ecosystems. Basilosaurus is actually a Cenozoic, so more recent after the extinction of most dinosaurs, actually a marine mammal. So it's actually an ancient whale that lived between 30 and 40 million years ago. So this is an artist reconstruction. You can see the tail has the marine up and down, the mammal up and down tail versus the side to side fish or reptile tail. I pulled a map from the paleobiology database, and hopefully this is coming up on whatever streaming device you're on, to show you where Basilosaurus fossils have been found. So there are a couple of different species, at least 2 species of Basilosaurus. The first ones were actually found along the Gulf Coast of North America. So in kind of the Alabama, Mississippi region down here. But then there are other occurrences in Europe and Northern Africa as well. And so this is kind of an interesting geographic distribution, but I did want to bring up that it's important to remember what the Earth looked like 30 to 40 million years ago. So this is a map of what it looked like, or what the continents looked like in the Eocene, so when Basilosaurus would have lived. And so you can see there's a lot of flooding that's going on. A lot of the continents aren't in the same forms and shapes and exposures as they are today. So a lot of Europe and then Northern Africa as well are covered by shallow marine warm waters. And so these are the areas where Basilosaurus lived. And then also you see the East Coast and the southern coast of North America looked very different as well. And so the last part of what Isaac was asking is, what do I think it ate? So the cool thing about Basilosaurus is that we've actually found Basilosaurus specimens with stomach contents. And so this tells us that they ate sharks and other fish. There's also some evidence from the kind of African and European species that it may have actually eaten other types of early ancient whales as well, and marine mammals. So there's a type of animal called a Dorodon that has been found as stomach contents as well. So we have a little bit of idea what it ate, and probably very similar to like what orcas or killer whales would eat today. Some sharks, some bony fish, and probably some other marine mammals. So great questions, Isaac. Thank you for that. Next question, we had one come in from Twitter, from Steve. He asks, how long does it take for a fossil to opalize? And what are the most recent opalized fossils? So for those who don't know what opalization is, it's something that can happen to fossils, either bone or soft tissue or shell or anything like that, where the original material is actually replaced by opal. And opal is just a hydrated silica. So silica is like what glass is, or beach sand. And so it gets this beautiful crystallization pattern. So here's an ammonite. That's the empty spaces have been filled in by an opal, and then the original shell material has been replaced by opal as well. Fossilized wood or petrified wood is actually another example of opalization, where the original woody structure is replaced by silica in a lot of cases. So I wasn't really sure what Steve was asking about the most recent opalized fossils, whether he's talking about the youngest ones to have been found fossilized, or whether kind of what the most recent finds are. So there's this pretty cool paper this is from 2005 when this paper came out, and this is from a bird that was silicified, so had started to get silica encrusting on the fossil that actually preserved like beautiful feathers in 3 dimensions. And really cool, from a very recent Quaternary hot springs deposit. So one of the interesting things from this study that gets at the first part of Steve's question is that the process of silica actually attaching to the original mineral structure and replacing it happens very, very quickly. And we're talking within days. And so there are a lot of studies watching how birds and other animals decay, and feather structures start breaking down within a couple of days. And since the feathers are preserved in 3 dimensions with silica encrusted on them, we know that the silica incrustation started, within just a couple of days of when this bird died and fell into the hot springs. There are other studies that show that things can be completely replaced, fossils or organisms could be completely replaced by silica within, years to decades. And so it really, that's the fast side of the process, but it really depends on the chemical and physical conditions during burial to really determine how long a process is going to take. All in all, the entire process of fossilization, how it happens, how quickly it happens under the exact conditions in which it happens, we still have a lot of work to do on that. So these are great questions, and where we're still trying to push the limits of our knowledge in terms of how fast fossilization happens. So this is kind of like the speed at which it happens. Some of the most recent fossilized opalized fossils. So this was a really recent bird. It wasn't too far in the past when this happened. But in terms of recent studies that have come out, so this is a 2020 study, so just came out this year, that's actually looking at an arthropod, so that is encased and coated with opal and an opal deposit. So these types of things are still being found, you know, not every day, but are continuing to be found and continuing to be studied. So some really cool research that's coming out of some of these exceptional preservations that tells us not only what these animals were and how and where they lived, but also how they were fossilized. So great question. Thank you for that. This was one of my favorite ones that we got. So the question came from Instagram on why do fossil bones stick to tongues when licked? So this is a thing. And this is something that kind of gets passed around word of mouth about how to identify a fossil. And there are different ways to identify a fossil. You can do it by texture. You can do it by looking at shapes and patterns. And then one of kind of the, I don't know if this is an urban legend, since it can actually be true, is to touch it to your tongue, or in this case, lick your finger and touch it to your finger. And so where rock or soil or something will, you know, just get your mouth dirty, a fossil will actually stick to your tongue or to a wet surface. So not all fossils do this, but a lot of them do. And this is actually because of the surface texture of the bone. So bone has a lot of pores and capillaries and internal structures that create holes on the surface. And so when you put a wet, whether it's a finger or a tongue, object to the bone, there's a little bit of a suction or a little bit of a vacuum that occurs that will cause the bone to stick because of the porous nature of it. So I was trying to think about examples for this. So this is a bone, these are bones, leg bones actually from a sea turtle that we have in collections. So this is Protostega, which is a Cretaceous sea turtle that we have here in our collections at the Sternberg Museum. And so I wanted to kind of zoom in, if this works on y'all's screens, on what the texture of this bone looks like. So you can see kind of fibrous patterns and things like that. So this is actually a really young individual, probably only 3 to 4 years old, so still growing fast. And all of the canals inside the bone that bring blood and nutrients as that bone is growing are still opened on the surface. So there's a very rough texture and a very rough surface. And so this is definitely a fossil that will stick to your tongue or a wet finger when when in contact. So fossilized bones stick to tongue when licked because of the porous nature on the surface of the bone. So great question, and something that actually does happen. Okay. One of the questions we got via Twitter. So Cuban Croc 2 actually submitted, well, to me, they seemed like 2 separate questions. So I'm covering them as 2 separate questions. So Cuban Croc asks, have there been any more Paleocene fossil and ambers discovered? And so I'm not really sure about what they're asking anymore since when, but I actually found a cool image from a paper from 2018, so really recent. So again, showing the map of what the world looked like during the Paleocene. So we're talking 65 to 55 million years ago. And all of these, the red star is where the paper is focused, but all of the yellow dots actually represent other Paleocene fossil amber localities. So you can kind of see the distribution. We have a couple in North America. This one's looking in Alaska. We have some from Southern Europe, Asia, as well as Madagascar, or sorry, this is India. And so this one is a 2008 publication, 2018 publication, so fairly recent. And it had some great images in it. They found so much stuff in these amber deposits, which is really, really cool. Amber deposits are really important for us for our understanding of ancient ecosystems, because a lot of time amber will preserve things that don't preserve very well. So plant material, insects, arachnids, things like that really don't fossilize well because their external skeleton is so thin, or they just have to have really, really extremely calm in the perfect conditions for fossilization. So amber is really important because we get this glimpse into ecosystems and organisms that we wouldn't normally get because they just don't fossilize well. So in this deposit in Alaska, they found both fungi, which you can't really imagine getting fossilized well in general. There's no hard parts, it's soft only. They had plants, so they had woody material and leaves. They had arachnids, they had spider egg sacs, they had spiders, they had mites, insects. So they have like this is the leg of a roach up here. And I think there's a caddis fly. And then actually what I thought the coolest one was they actually had this worker ant. So they could actually determine what kind of the role of the ant was based on the morphology. So based on the shape of it. And you can just see the extreme preservation that you get in amber, which is really, really cool. And kind of, I think does a good job of illustrating why they're so important for giving us these little glimpses that we wouldn't normally get, because some animals and different organisms just aren't prone to fossilizing very well. Let's see here. Okay, so the next question, this was the second question from Cuban Croc 2 on Twitter. And this question is focusing on a group of birds that started evolving right after the big dinosaur extinction 66 million years ago. And the type of birds, the Phorusrhacids, they are also known as terror birds because they're very big. So I kind of pulled an image here where you can see how big these birds got. So larger than a 6 foot tall human, these big hooked beaks on them, big thick legs. They are flightless, so they're not going to be flying around, they're going to be running around. They evolved in South America probably around 62 million years ago, and then they spread to North America. And then there are possible occurrences in Europe as well as Africa. So Phorusrhacids are all extinct, and there's really only one relative that's still alive, and that's the Siriema from South America. There are two species that live in South America. They don't get nearly as large as the Phorusrhacids did. So sorry, I don't know if it's he or not. Cuban Croc was asking about 3 specific species or genera, so 3 different types of Phorusrhacids. And each one of these different types of Phorusrhacids lived at a slightly different time and in a different place. So Lavocadavis was from Africa. The Eleutheronis was from Europe, so I think France and Switzerland, and the Paleopsilopterus was from Brazil. And that's where they found the Paleopterus is older, it's Paleocene, while the other 2 are Eocene. So specifically, Cuban Croc is asking that even though these 3 different types of birds have been named to different species, could they really be the same type of animal that just lived in different times and different places? So there is a tendency to call different animals from different times and different places different names. And you know, that's something that was done very commonly before we developed more recent, more modern methods for how to determine one species from another in the fossil record. So we don't know for sure whether all of these animals were different species or whether they could have been the same one. And that's because of the type of material that was preserved. So the Lavacoavis was actually only known by one femur. And so the other 2 types of Phorusrhacids actually don't have a femur preserved with them. And so you can't compare anything. And that's how we determine who's the same as whom and who's related to whom, is by actually comparing the fossil material what it looks like, the shape and the size and all the little characteristics of it. And so if we don't have a femur from all three species, we can't actually compare the different species to each other using that bone. So we can compare Eleutheroornis and Paleopsilopterus to each other because they do have some of the same bones in common. So some of the ankle bones and foot bones and lower leg bones are preserved in both species. And looking at those comparisons, that they really are different enough to call them different species. And so we can't say for sure, but in some cases we know that Eleutheroornis and Paleopsilopterus are not the same species. They're different enough to warrant different names. And another interesting thing to think about is not only there's a time difference, but there's a place difference. So I'm throwing up this map again of what Earth looked like in the Eocene. And so you can see that if we have one from Brazil, one from Africa, and one from Europe, that there are ocean basins that are separating all of these different types of birds. And these are birds that don't fly. And so they're not going to be moving across ocean basins quickly. And we're not even sure how and if they're moving across ocean basins. Some of the material for these species is so fragmentary that scientists are debating whether they are Fruceratids or whether they're something else. And so right now there are too many question marks to really kind of say that they're the same thing. So people are calling them different names. So not only do they live at different times, but they live in very different places. And we actually can see some differences between the bones in some of these species. So at this point, I don't think anybody's going to be looking at calling them the same type of bird. And so then the last question we got is more of a career question versus a question about a scientific process or a paleontological process or type of animal. And this one is about, depending on where you are in the field of paleontology, what the pay is. And this is actually a question that I get quite a lot. And so, you know, it to some degree, it depends on what you do and how far you go in school. There are jobs that you can get within paleontology with a bachelor's degree. A lot of those are going to be in things like paleo consulting. So especially in kind of the Western US and California, if you know an oil company wants to come in and put in a new well pad on public land, there needs to be a paleo prospecting done to see if there's any material there. In California, anytime there's a new building, there needs to be a survey for any sort of paleontological or archaeological material. And so those jobs, you know, again, entry level can be bachelor's or master's, and those can be very market dependent, actually. So if you're in Utah or Colorado or Wyoming working for a consulting company that's mostly taking oil contracts, it's going to depend on what the oil market is doing. So, you know, the summer of 2008, when oil or gas was almost $5 a gallon, you know, there's a lot of money in that. But then a couple of months later, when the economy crashed and oil wells shut down, things weren't so great. So things like that can be seasonal. There are a lot of jobs that are typically, they can be bachelor's, a lot of them are masters in a museum. And so working in collections, working in prep labs, working in education, things like that. You know, you're definitely making a living wage, and it's very much going to depend on what the cost of living is in your area, but you're not going to be going into paleontology, I think, on any level for the money, because even at the top level of PhD, you're still going to be working in a museum or a university. And again, it's very, you know, it's very comfortable living, and you're definitely making living wages, but you know, you're not going to be making as much as a medical doctor with a PhD doctorate. And so, you know, so much of paleontology, it's very rewarding. And what I get to do every day, I love, whether it's on the university or, whether it's in the classroom as a professor or whether it's in the museum, working with the public or doing education or doing research. you know, it's very much a labor of love between the amount of time that you have to spend in school, in some cases, depending on the job you want, to you know, there are going to be caps on what salaries are going to be because you're typically working around either museum education or university education in those markets. So not a great answer, and you can definitely look at things are becoming a little bit more transparent with things like Glassdoor and you know, anything that's state or public institution you should be able to access at least to some degree what salaries are for different positions. That should be pretty open record. But you know, it's definitely something that you spend enough time in school, you don't just kind of accidentally find yourself as a paleontologist in a lot of cases. There are different ways to do paleontology though, other than, you know, getting the formal degree and going that route. You know, working as a volunteer, working with universities or museums, other institutions like that. There are a lot of avocational paleontologists that you know, have non-paleo jobs and then still work with researchers, work with universities and museums to be a part of research, and they can be very successful even though, you know, their day-to-day salary isn't necessarily coming from paleontology. So there are lots of ways to get involved, you know, whether you go the formal academic route or not. But great question, and a series of great questions. If anybody else has any other questions, you know, feel free to leave them in the comments, and I will be happy to come through and answer them. Otherwise, let us know how you're doing, and we hope y'all have a great National Fossil Day. Thank you very much.